Hey, this is Pierre Draco talking, working at Planet Technologies. I just wanted to shoot this video because I have more and more discussion with customers who are using or who are gonna use Teams soon for collaboration. And so I'm doing a lot of assessments, having meetings with interviews with different employees, doing surveys. And there's a question that comes often, and it's is Teams the same thing than SharePoint? Because, SharePoint, there's something wrong. And I can feel that people are not satisfied with SharePoint. They have a bad taste of using SharePoint. So when I do the interview, I ask this question: Are you using SharePoint? How are you using it? Is it valuable? And I will say 90% of the time people don't like SharePoint at all. They fail to use it, they quit. And I'm not against SharePoint. SharePoint, the first version of SharePoint is 21 years old. And even it was called SharePoint 2001. So, and before there was a pre-version called Tahoe. And I worked for Microsoft for a long time working on SharePoint. So I was an advocate of SharePoint actually. But along the years, it added more and more features, and it's pretty complex. If you're not an IT person or you're not tech savvy, it's pretty complex. And on top of that, there was some customers, there were some customers who wanted people to add metadata when they were uploading a document. They asked them to check in, check out. And this created a terrible experience for users because obviously people don't want to lose time to add metadata, think about what kind of metadata I should add. In some situation, I'm not saying that you couldn't do that. There's some situation where it's valid, but the overall experience with SharePoint is usually not good with end users. And when I do survey, I can see that clearly that people are blaming on SharePoint for several reasons: the user experience, the permission management, the metadata, and the complexity in general. So, should you use SharePoint? That's the question. And you know that behind Teams, behind the scene, there is SharePoint. So SharePoint is a very good tool. Actually, to me, it's a very good framework to store information. So, and also OneDrive is built on SharePoint. You might not know, but behind the scene, it's leveraging SharePoint capabilities. So I think it's more about framing it. So the way I frame it is, Teams should be the place where you're working. You're working on documents, that's where you're going to end up. And it's easier to work on documents in Teams than in SharePoint because the UI of Teams is way more simple. It has less functionality, even if Microsoft is trying to put more and more SharePoint functionality into Teams, which I don't think is a good thing. But it's still simpler. And so the way I frame it, if you're working on documents, living documents, you have to use Teams. Either you do that in a group chat if it's just temporary with a few people working on one document, do that in a group chat if you don't have a team for that. If you if you have a team on project or whatever subject you're working on, you might want to create a team, a Microsoft team, and work on document there. There are huge benefits. And behind the scene, it's stored in SharePoint, so you have all the potential SharePoint features. If you're an advanced user, you can switch to SharePoint and use it. But Teams is for living documents. But you still need SharePoint for several use cases. One is you want to communicate with your crew or with a department, with the whole organization. You might want to have a SharePoint communication site to share some information with an entire department or the whole organization. And even that, you can include it in Teams with Viva connections, but I'm not going there. So SharePoint is a good solution when you have to create um, a content web content to share with your users. So then the users are just consuming. They're not really trying to create web parts and or make complicated things. So here you just need to be sure that the people who are publishing the content understand how to use SharePoint. And so that's the first use case, web content management. The second use case is, I will call it knowledge management, knowledge base, if you want to centralize final documents. And it can be combined with the web content management. But if you want to share public documents like HR, final documents, or marketing, or whatever it is, policies, that should be done in SharePoint. And again, it should be done by a few number of people who are going to create the documents, then, which represent the asset of the organization, and store them in SharePoint, organize them in SharePoint, and present them to the users. And so people can have access to those documents directly, and the experience is really simple because they just read the documents. Eventually, they can download the documents if you allow that. So that's the use case for SharePoint. SharePoint content management and final document. Web content management and final documents. Teams for living documents, and OneDrive for personal documents, drafts, or if you want to store documents that you want to work later on, you can save them in OneDrive because it's easier for you to navigate in this personal knowledge base. So that's how I frame it. If you're trying to collaborate in SharePoint, you can do that because it's exactly the same thing than Teams without the conversation, but with more complexity. And if you're asking people to understand how to create web parts, how they can manage the web parts, the permissions, that open a can of worms, and people can struggle, and people don't have really the time to struggle. That's why Teams is so popular. So I really encourage you to focus on Teams most of the time. Even in Teams, you can integrate content coming from SharePoint directly into Teams, so they can even not leave Teams and have access to the SharePoint final documents in read-only. So I think the main focus should be on Teams. You need to re-explain how to position each product to what use cases. I think it's very important. And focus on training people or educating people or informing people, creating best practice around Teams for everyone, and then you can focus on have a focus on training, education, awareness on SharePoint just for a dedicated number of people who are going to publish final documents or create web content management portal, and eventually you can expand that to the Viva suite. So have that in mind. SharePoint has a bad reputation. If you confusing people saying, SharePoint is part of Microsoft 365, they might say, okay, Microsoft 365 is not for me. It's really, have a new approach with Teams. Even if SharePoint is behind the scenes, SharePoint is a good product, is a strong product, but Teams is the way to go, is the way to use to manage documents. It's way more simple to use for end user. The adoption will be better. The challenge is more a governance challenge, so people understand and align how they work together and work on documents, but work collaboratively together. That's the main challenge with Teams. The usability of Teams is pretty simple. It's getting richer and richer, so sometimes you need to adjust, you need to communicate, re-educate people, but all in, it's a very good product. The main challenge is the governance around this product, best practices. So SharePoint is a good product. Don't use it as a front end for everything. Use it as a back end for SharePoint, for Teams. And eventually, when you have to work on final documents, use SharePoint, but it doesn't concern a lot of people. Hope this was interesting.